12 years. Say it slowly and let the weight of it settle, because the number is not a detail. It is the whole first half of the story. 12 years is long enough for a newborn to grow into a child on the edge of adulthood. And in fact, at the very moment this story takes place, a few streets away, a 12-year-old girl lay dying in her father's house, the same span of time that had been draining the life out of a woman in the crowd. One girl had been alive for 12 years and was slipping toward death. One woman had been dying slowly for 12 years and was reaching for life. The Gospel of Mark ties their two stories together with that number on purpose, and we will come back to the girl. But it is the woman we have come to meet. A woman with no name recorded, whose entire identity had been swallowed up by an affliction that had lasted, now, 12 years. For 12 years she had suffered from a constant flow of blood, a hemorrhage that would not stop. And in her world, that condition did far more than weaken her body. Under the law of Moses, a woman with such a discharge was ceremonially unclean, and not for a week, but for as long as the bleeding continued, which meant she had been unclean for 12 unbroken years. Understand what that actually did to her life, because the physical illness was only the beginning of the loss. To be perpetually unclean meant that anything she sat on became unclean. Anyone she touched became unclean, and so, by necessity, she could not be touched. For 12 years, no embrace, no hand on her shoulder. If she was married, the marriage could not function as a marriage. More likely, she had been sent away long ago. She could not enter the temple to worship. She could not join the ordinary life of her community without contaminating it. She was, in the fullest sense, an untouchable, cut off from God's house, cut off from human affection, cut off from belonging. 12 years of a specific and terrible loneliness, the loneliness of a person who cannot be held. And she had tried everything to end it. Mark records it with unusual bluntness. She had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Read those words as the summary of 12 years of hope, repeatedly raised and repeatedly crushed. She had gone to doctor after doctor. She had submitted to whatever treatments the medicine of her day could offer. And some of those ancient remedies for her condition were painful, humiliating, and useless. She had emptied her savings, spent every coin she had, poured out her entire fortune chasing a cure. And the result of all that money and all that suffering was that she was not better. She was worse. This is the portrait of a person at the absolute end of human hope. Every avenue exhausted, every resource gone, every expert consulted, and every expert failed. If you have ever reached the place where you have tried everything, spent everything, prayed everything, and nothing worked and it only got worse, you have stood where this woman stood after 12 years. She was not a woman with options. She was a woman with nothing left. And then, into that emptiness, came a rumor. She heard the reports about Jesus. She heard about a teacher from Nazareth who healed the sick, opened blind eyes, cleansed lepers, spoke, and the paralyzed walked. And something in her, buried under 12 years of disappointment, stirred back to life. Hope. Not the naive hope of someone who has never been let down. She had been let down more times than she could count, but the fierce, desperate hope of someone who has nothing left to lose and one last thing to try. And she formed a plan, and the plan tells you a great deal about her situation. She did not plan to walk up to Jesus and ask him for help. She could not. As an unclean woman, she should not have been in that pressing crowd at all. Every person she brushed against, she was defiling. She certainly could not touch a rabbi and ask him to lay hands on her, because for a holy man to touch an unclean woman was unthinkable. So her plan was to come from behind, unseen, to slip through the crowd, to reach out and touch just the edge of his clothing, and then to disappear before anyone knew she had been there. If I touch even his garments, she told herself, I will be made well. A secret healing, a stolen cure. Reach, touch, and vanish, and no one would ever have to know the untouchable woman had been in the crowd. Now here's where we start to see what this woman actually understood, because her plan, desperate and hidden as it was built on a series of insights that were more profound than she probably realized. And the first thing she understood was who Jesus was. Look at what she reached for. Mark says she reached for his garment, and the parallel Gospels specify the part she aimed at, the fringe, the edge, the tassel of his cloak. Every observant Jewish man in that day wore tassels on the corners of his outer garment. They were commanded in the law of Moses, worn as a reminder of God's commandments. And there was a rich thread of hope woven around those hem corners, because the same Hebrew word could mean corner, edge, or wing, and the prophet Malachi had promised that when the Messiah came, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. Healing in his wings, in the corners of his garment. It is entirely possible that when this woman reached trembling for the very edge of Jesus' cloak, she was reaching for the exact place the prophets had promised healing would be found. That she had connected this Jesus not merely to the doctors who had failed her, but to the Messiah the scriptures foretold. After 12 years of physicians who were only men, she staked everything on the belief that this man was categorically different, that in him, and even in the edge of what he wore, was the healing that heaven itself had promised. That is not a small faith. That is a woman who understood something the crowd pressing all around him did not. And the second thing she understood is the deepest, and it turns the entire logic of her religion upside down. Everything in the law of Moses about uncleanness moved in one direction. Uncleanness was contagious, and it flowed from the unclean to the clean. If you touched something unclean, you became unclean. If she touched Jesus, then by every rule she had lived under for 12 years, she should have made him unclean. That was the terror underneath her secrecy. An unclean woman touching a holy rabbi was not just improper, it was a kind of contamination. But watch what she believed instead. She believed that if she touched him, the flow would not go from her to him. It would go from him to her. That his wholeness would overwhelm her brokenness, that his cleanness would swallow her uncleanness, that instead of her defiling him, he would heal her. And she was right. The instant her fingers brushed the hem, Mark says, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. 12 years ended in a heartbeat. And notice what did not happen. Jesus did not become unclean. In every other encounter under the old law, holiness was fragile and impurity was powerful. Touch the leper, and you catch the leprosy. But when the unclean touches Jesus, the direction of the current reverses. His holiness is not fragile. It is contagious. His wholeness is not something she could contaminate. It is something that floods into her and makes her whole. This is the gospel in miniature, the whole story of what Jesus came to do, compressed into a single touch. He takes our uncleanness onto himself, and he gives us his cleanness in return. Everyone else in her life caught her impurity and recoiled. Jesus absorbed it and gave her his purity. She understood, perhaps better than the disciples did, that this man did not operate by the rules of contamination. He operated by the rules of grace. She had her healing. Her plan had worked perfectly. The cure was hers, secret and complete, and all that remained was to slip away into the crowd and disappear back into her quiet, restored life. But Jesus stopped. In the middle of a moving crowd, on his way to the deathbed of a dying child, he stopped and turned and asked, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples thought the question was almost absurd. The crowd was pressing in on him from every side, jostling him, bumping him, dozens of hands brushing against him with every step. And he asks, "Who touched me?" But Jesus knew the difference, and the difference is one of the most important truths in the whole story. Many people were touching him. Only one had touched him. The crowd pressed against him out of curiosity, out of excitement, out of the sheer crush of bodies, and none of them received anything, because pressing near Jesus is not the same as reaching out to Jesus in faith. You can be in the crowd around him, surrounded by him, close enough to feel his robe against your arm, and receive nothing. One woman, behind him, unseen, reached out in desperate faith and touched the edge of his garment, and power went out of him and into her. Proximity is not faith. The whole town was near him. One woman believed, and he felt the difference. Mark says Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone out from him. So why did he stop? She was already healed. She could have vanished, and her body would have been just as whole. He did not stop because he needed to complete the cure. He stopped because he wanted to give her something far greater than a healed body, and because he refused to let their encounter end as an anonymous transaction. Think about what would have happened if he had let her slip away. She would have carried her healing home in secret, a woman who stole a miracle from the back of a crowd and ran. She would have been physically well and still, in every other way, an outsider, unnamed, unseen, hiding her 12 years of shame unaddressed even in the moment of her rescue. Jesus wanted more for her than that. He did not want a healing she took in the dark. He wanted her face. He wanted her name known. He wanted to move her out of the shadows of the crowd and into a face-to-face relationship so that she would leave not as a woman who got away with something, but as a woman who had been seen and welcomed and restored in front of everyone. So he kept looking, and she realized she could not stay hidden. And Mark tells us she came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. Feel the courage of that. The thing she had spent 12 years hiding, the condition too shameful to name, the reason she could not be touched, she now declared it out loud in front of the whole pressing crowd at the feet of Jesus. The stolen secret healing became an open, public confession. And the fear she trembled with was surely the fear of exposure, the fear of rebuke, the fear that this holy man would be angry that an unclean woman had dared to touch him and defile him in front of everyone. She braced for condemnation. What she received instead was the single most tender word in the entire scene. He said, "Daughter." Just that word first, daughter. And it is worth knowing that in all four Gospels, in every recorded conversation Jesus ever had, this is the only time he calls anyone by that name. Not once does he call a follower, a friend, a woman he heals, daughter, except here, except her. To a woman with no name in the story, no husband we know of, no place in the community, no family that could claim her, cut off for 12 years from every belonging a person can have. He gives, first of all, a relationship. He calls her into a family. He makes the untouchable outcast a daughter in front of the very crowd that had shunned her. And then he says, "Your faith has made you well." The word he uses there means more than physical healing. It is the word for saved, for made whole in every sense. It was not the magic of the tassel that healed her. It was her faith reaching through the tassel to him. And he wants her to know it, wants her to own it, wants her to walk away, understanding that she was not a thief who got lucky, but a believer who was welcomed. And then his last words to her: "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Peace, the Hebrew shalom. Wholeness, the deep well-being she had been denied for 12 years. He does not merely fix her bleeding. He restores her body, her belonging, her name, her worship, her place in the world, and her soul. The physical healing in the end was the smallest thing that happened to her at that hem. And now remember the girl. Because all of this, the stopping, the searching, the confession, the tender word, all of it took time. And time was the one thing a dying 12-year-old did not have. While Jesus lingered over the woman, messengers arrived from the ruler's house with the words that come to all of us eventually: "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" The delay for the woman had, it seemed, cost the girl her life. But it had not. Because Jesus turned to the grieving father and said, "Do not fear, only believe." And he walked into that house of mourning and took the dead girl by the hand and said, "Talitha cumi," little girl, arise. And she got up and walked. The interruption was never an interruption at all. Jesus had time for the important, named, respected synagogue ruler and time for the nameless, unclean, hidden woman in the crowd. He was never too busy for the one. And the delay that felt like a disaster to Jairus became the very thing that stretched his faith from "Come heal my sick daughter" to believe in the God who raises the dead. Two daughters. Two desperate people at the opposite ends of their society, a powerful man of the synagogue and an untouchable woman of the streets, and the same Savior stopped for both, and neither one reached out to him in vain. What this woman understood, in the end, is the thing every one of us has to learn when we finally come to the bottom of our own strength. She understood what to do when every other hope has failed, not to give up on hope, but to aim it at the only one who could actually carry it. She understood that she did not need to be clean first, or qualified, or worthy, or presentable. She needed only to reach in faith for the edge of his garment, and even a fingertip of real faith was enough. She understood that her shame would not repel him, but that his wholeness would overwhelm her shame. And she learned when he turned and called her daughter that he did not want to fix her from a distance and let her disappear. He wanted to know her, name her, and bring her home. So whatever has been draining the life out of you, whatever your 12 years have been, whatever affliction or shame or exhaustion has left you feeling untouchable, whatever hope you have spent all your resources chasing and are no better but worse, the invitation of this story is not to have more strength or a cleaner record or a better plan. It is simply to reach. He is passing close enough to touch. Your uncleanness will not defile him. His wholeness will heal you, and he will not let you take your healing in secret and slip away unknown, because he is not after an anonymous transaction with you. He is after you. He will turn and look and find your face in the crowd and call you by a name you were sure you had lost the right to be called. Not outcast, not unclean, not too far gone, but daughter, son, mine. Go in peace.